Hello. Hi, my name is Caroline Mayer. I'm actually from a small island developing country. I'm an international environmental lawyer there. Then my question is for Pippa, actually. I'd be curious to hear, in light of the conclusion of the third SIDS conference last week, do you have any insights into the national perspective of, small island developing states in your region?
Okay, SIDS question. Let's take 3 or 4 questions. I'll go behind, if I may, for a moment.
Hi, I'm Matt Finch from the Fleming Policy Centre. My question's for Mel, and can you talk me through the process why you explicitly decided to de-link your side of things with the UNFCCC process?
Yes, one more over there.
Thank you, Alison Wright from Plan International. Another question for Mel. Thank you for your perspectives on the Open Working Group process. You talked a bit about the interface between the Open Working Group process and the UNFCCC and the kind of the politics around that. As one of the other members of the panel mentioned, obviously 2015 is the deadline for the new DRR framework as well. Could you talk about anything about the links and the sort of the interface between that within the discussions, how that links to the climate change development agenda?
Yeah, thank you for that, because that's part of our menu later on this afternoon, that issue as well, so that's a good one. Yes, Kit, one last question, and we'll go
so
back
Kit Vaughan, Care International. Very quick question to Mel. Do you support I'll give another question. Do you support a standalone climate goal as UK government? And to the panel, is it not just about development, but it's also about the politics and the history of where climate change has come from, in the sense that we're not just talking about development and ODA, we're actually talking about some of the historic responsibility and the political issues that underpin the whole debate?
There's some great questions there. Debbie Hillier, my former colleague from Oxfam, has written with 17 goals and 169 targets. There's clearly a pressure to reduce them. How can we ensure there's an effective balance in the pizza? She doesn't use that word, but across daily pizza. So the number of slices may get smaller, or the number of topping options may reduce. But I guess, to use your analogy, how do we get the balance right? And I think that's not a question only to Mel, and I don't want to put all the questions on your shoulders, Mel. We could do with some reflections on that issue across the panel. There's some other specific questions. I'll come back to those. But David, do you want to pick up perhaps on Kit's point about the politics and the sort of the process as well?
Well, of course, this is inevitably a political process, and it has to take into account historic responsibility. I think really everybody knows that. I don't think that's controversial. The question, of course, is how, and that's very controversial as to how you do it. But I think WWF's perspective comes slightly different. I remember when I was at the Rio conference having a long conversation with a member of the UK negotiating team, because at Rio he sort of felt, we managed to come out with something that was a reasonable outcome, and we'd worked phenomenally hard to get it and negotiated like mad and done all these political deals and so on and so on and so on. And he said, I'm puzzled, why are you and your NGO colleagues not saying, well done, you've done a good job here. I mean, it was pretty difficult, and you've negotiated effectively and done a deal. I said, and I remember I couldn't quite get it. Anyway, the next morning, when we were going back down to the conference, I thought about it overnight, and I said, here's the issue, I said. When you, from the government perspective, look at this, you look at it from the point of view of what is politically possible, and you're saying, in terms of what is politically possible, this is a good deal. I said, from a WWF perspective, we look at it from the point of view of what is scientifically necessary. And I'm afraid from what is scientifically necessary, it's not a good deal. And I think one of the things we do need in this process is to ensure that we keep coming back to the science and the facts and the evidence. It can be a little bit of debate about the margins, but broadly the facts are pretty well established, and I think that's an important test when the political machinations are going, to just keep reminding ourselves this is ultimately a problem about physics and chemistry, and unfortunately and very frustratingly you can't negotiate physics.
Mel, there were a number of questions.
Okay, I'll have a bash. So just to clarify, we didn't take a decision to delink the SDGs from the UNFCCC. It was more, what I was trying to convey was a sense in the room of the importance of not holding the politics of one hostage to fortune of the politics of the other, notwithstanding however that politics might run. But so why did that happen? I mean, for me, I think there were probably two considerations or two concerns in people's mind. One was process-based and one was substantive. The process-based one was simply that, you know, in a very, very easy way of looking at it, we would end up not being able to conclude the SDGs. If we linked the UNFCCC and the SDGs, one risk was we wouldn't be able to conclude the SDGs without waiting for December 2015. And so, in other words, we'll be holding up a global agreement on the SDG framework for an outcome in the UNFCCC, which, you know, at this point in time, we can't predict. Well, very close to the point we can't predict. And so what would happen if both collapsed? What would happen if one didn't conclude in a way that it could have concluded and reinforced the other? So the theory was conclude the SDGs as well as you possibly can do, because that's win to the sale of multilateralism, which is win to the sale of the UNFCCC. So there's nothing nefarious there. I think it was more a sort of tactical judgment on the part of politically minded people in the room. But I think there's also a substantive point to it, which is that, and this goes back to the point I made about there genuinely being goodwill in the room on climate. I think people felt that you could make ground on adaptation resilience. I think this is to Andrew's point. You could make ground on adaptation and resilience very easily in the SDG framework, perhaps less easily on the mitigation side because of the links to the UNFCCC, but let's make the ground that we can without entering into the sort of terminology that one would find in the climate negotiations and make our lives a lot more difficult. So it's kind of, I guess, a practical, more of an opportunistic approach. There was a question about the joining up of processes, various multilateral negotiations next year. I mean, there are many. There's not only climate in the Open Working Group, there's also the trade negotiations, there's also the financing for development negotiations of the DRR. There are multiple set of multilateral opportunities next year. It's going to be complicated to work all these through simultaneously. It feels a little bit to me at the moment like structured chaos, to be completely honest with you. It isn't entirely clear how one is going to play off the other. I think what the principle driving our perspective in all of these things is we need to show that multilateralism can work next year. Next year is really critical for that. And so whether we can pull a really good trick and make sure that the trade speaks to the climate, speaks to the SDGs, watch this space, we'll give it our best shot. But I think we very much take the point that all of these negotiations have ramifications one on the other, and we need to think about that carefully and systematically, and join up across government in the UK, but also across governments internationally, which we do. I mean, the UK team is very, very much a Whitehall effort. Do we support climate? I'm not going to duck this question. Do we support climate change as a standalone goal? Well, maybe I am going to duck it. We don't not support it. I think we... sorry. It certainly wasn't on the Prime Minister's to-do list when he appointed our envoy, David Hallam, and David appointed me. All of that said, what's clear is that we need to land a framework which drives action for the next 10 to 15 years. And, we need to make sure that that lands within a strong international consensus. And what is clear, looking at my Oxfam colleague here, is that international consensus is shifting towards wanting to see climate much more prominently in here than perhaps we originally started, much more towards a goal up in lights than just through integration or reference to 2 degrees. And so if that is what it takes to land a framework within which we can all live peacefully and happily, then yes, I think we would support it if it came to it. But it isn't, at the moment at least, up there in terms of one of the key things the UK is pushing. That isn't to say that we don't strongly support integration and visibility of 2 degrees and fundamentally the principle that climate change is critical for poverty eradication, because we do. And then there's Debbie Hillier had a great question. How do we bring the pizza slices down whilst ensuring integration?
Yeah, reduce number of goals, ensure effective balance between social, environmental and economic.
And it's a fantastic question, and I think that is that's the $1 million question. if we want to see a shorter and more concise agenda, which I think, there's no secret the UK government does, how do we get there whilst not knocking out such important things as this? And I think the answer certainly for us at the moment, is we just really need to do our homework, actually. We need to know what a 10-goal framework and a 12-goal framework and a 15-goal framework looks like with, to borrow a phrase from Bernadette, with the green thread running through each one. And we need to do our homework, and we need to do it with you. You're already starting with the work that WWF is doing, but we don't have the monopoly of ideas on that, but we understand it's important.
Thank you, Mel. There's a question on SIDS, Pippa. There's a couple of questions online, Andrew, which you might be able to help with, to do with the open working group considering business having a role and private sector. Perhaps you can describe what you know, at least, of the private sector engagement. We'll do two quick answers, and we'll do one quick round of questions before tea. So Pippa, then Andrew, please.
Thank you, Sam. And I'd take the politics question. I think there's a politics international, there's a politics nationally, and linking it to Carl. Just going back on the Colombia one, this is about electoral accountability. An extreme weather event meant politically you actually came in saying you were going to do something about it. So it's not idealism, it became central to governance and to re-election. On the SID, the recent thing, from the Caribbean side is that this is critical. Climate has to be absolutely integrated, and from the Caribbean in particular, which was supported with its implementation plan to get to climate resilient development within the Caribbean, there is real concern that water security, so the issue around adaptation resilience with water security, is not there, and that's one of the big gaps, and they're very, very concerned about that. So it's as we bring it down, but how do we link that across? So I don't know if that helped with your question.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew?
On the question of the business involvement in either the process or the implementation, the open working group has actually been very unclear in putting forward any suggestions for how that ought to take place. I know that most members of the open working group recognise that the delivery of actions to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals require business participation. Actions of business will be doing up most of it, but they have not been clear about how business should be involved, nor any other kind of non-state stakeholder, municipalities, civil society, etc. And so there is a gap, I think, in the vision of how this plays out of all of that. There are a couple of targets in there that are really for business to take action on, but it's not clear what the relationship is, and that, I think, is partly a reflection of the very big agenda that they had. It's also partly a reflection that this is the SDG process is a governmental process. It's a negotiation between governments, not between businesses or governments and other stakeholders.
So we're going to eat into your tea break for a few minutes, and I'll take some questions from the far side there. So the lady on the right first. Is there a microphone?
Thank you. Okay, thank you. My name is Margaret Lesuda, the Education Councillor, Kenya High Commission, and also a student of peace building. I'm happy that much reference has been made to Kenya, and I would just say that Mara is not what it is in the picture now because of government intervention. I also want to say thank you because WWF have really done a lot to help us in conservation in Kenya. Mine is rather, I don't know, it's a comment, but I would want to see much being said about the role of communities in climate change. Private sector, if I look at the issue of Mara, it is actually the communities that made an outcry and made the government to take action to send the other communities who are destroying Mara out of that. If I look at what is happening, and possibly WWF may have sponsored some programs in NRT, Northern Rangeland Trust, which is doing a great job through communities. So if we could support community initiatives, we'll be able even to realize peace. Because that's another element I would maybe wish that when we are talking about integration, we should also look at the role of peace in ensuring that we realize climate change. Because that organization, you can Google NRT. I have been a trustee until I was posted in the UK as an education counselor, and I can attest that the communities have been able to stop cutting trees and look for other alternatives. And governments need to look around and say, what is the alternative that we can give to these poor people as we wait for the long-term goals or the short-term goals, whatever it is, for us to realize climate change targets? What are the alternatives? The alternatives that communities in NRT took are to conserve the environment and to put up lodges to attract tourists. So tourism brought in money, they educated their children, they stopped cutting trees. They conserved, they stopped destroying the river, what can I call it, the water sources. They started planting trees. They started destroying the wildlife, and they started protecting. And today, even the poaching that we are talking about in Kenya, it is not as much in those areas where communities have woken up. Okay. So those are the comments I had, and I'm very impressed that we are also talking about integration. And I wish we could also look at it in the education kind of, from education. How early do we tell our children to conserve the environment?
Thank you very much. Can you pass the microphone to the gentleman next to you? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Just to follow on from that comment, Gareth Wall from the Commonwealth Local Government Forum.
Thank you.
In terms of relation to the communities, I'm just wondering about the role of a subnational government. There's a lot about the, obviously it's an international government negotiation. It's fantastic in Colombia that they're able to get it on the national agenda. I don't think it's going to be on the Scottish referendum or the national election here manifestos in a big way. But it is at the subnational level likely to be an important. So if Ali mentioned that it's at the district level that it's actually played out, and the framework or the implementation was mentioned in David's just at the end. But if you can dwell a little bit more on the role of subnational government, that would be great. Okay. Thanks.
Anyone else over this side? Any other questions over here? Okay. There's a nice question online about integration shouldn't rely on the developing countries themselves only, should not only, but also on how international institutions such as CDKN and WWF are integrating and cooperating, which is a nice challenge for us. Well, we are in the room together and collaborating as best, and I can assure you that we will seek to do it, more of it, and do it better. If there's no other question, I'm going to turn to the panelists here. My colleagues from the regions might want to pick up. Carl, do you want to pick up on the community point specifically?
I mean, I think that, sorry, it's Martha. I think that ties in absolutely perfectly with the stats on that show that Kenyans are concerned, and they're not looking necessarily to government for the solution, as in kind of I need ugali. They're looking to government for a much more complex solution, which says how do we solve this problem together? What are the principles? What are the issues? And that kind of pressure from the community level, of course, creates the impetus for government to act, to pass regulation, and then to be able to stand up against, because for every winner there's a loser. And how does government stand up against the losers? And sometimes the losers are very powerful. They're very economically powerful. They might not be visible, but they're powerful. And if communities are standing up very strongly, it makes it possible for government to withstand pressure from other sources and to do the right thing. I think that you're right, that this is you asked the question about responsibility for past climate change, well, for past emissions and therefore for climate change. I think that from the region, yes, we've got the party line which says that we are suffering the consequences of something which the developed world have caused over the last 100 years, and therefore there's responsibility and therefore action. And this is what, I mean, Sustainable Development Goals are about at their core. It's about guilt money, right? We're paying for something which we think we should be doing because it's important to us, and possibly because we're guilty because we caused it. But I think that the nuance in the debate or in the argument at a national level, in, for example, Martha's government, it's not so much, it's not a simplistic argument that says we're poor, we've suffered, you've caused it, we want the check. There's a growing realization that this is about an alternative economic pathway, that Kenya's going to have to invest its own resources, that it's going to have to mobilize its communities, it's going to have to deal with this problem with or without sustainable development goals and the money that might flow to realize them. And it's that realization, it might not be on the front line, but it's certainly with the governments that we work where leadership is being showed, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Kenya is a good example. It's what's driving the potential switch in an alternative economic pathway and the idea of avoided future emissions and committing to avoided future emissions, and then also understanding that the Sustainable Development Goals are universally applicable. So if your targets around greenhouse gas emissions or percentages of renewable energy, the targets of the UK in that respect will determine my sustainability. So therefore, let's get on the target, or let's get on the page. And I'm a little bit surprised that there hasn't been a stronger political voice from Africa. If I was there, I might ask the question, and I don't represent Africa, but if I was there, you might ask, why is no one's asking this? And the UNFCCC process has failed. It's delivered nothing for us in terms of, climate emissions. And therefore, why shouldn't we have very strong, ambitious targets in terms of sustainable development goals? And why can't we set the ambition at that level? And why do we have to worry about the politics of this institution versus that one and whose toes we're treading on? This is real, and we understand it, and it's about science. So, but anyway, I'm not there, so therefore we've got a much more polite political conversation happening.
Thank you, Carl. Ali, a couple of comments on the subnational issue, perhaps.
Yeah, just building on what David said earlier. There's a movement, or there is a different sets of discourse that happening from politically acceptable to scientifically necessary to ethically correct or right. Mm-hmm. As soon as we go to the subnational level with the communities, the debate is about this. Can we, in the process of SDGs, empower them to take local initiatives for local solutions? And in the Asian context, most of Asia is urban. So the climate battle and SDGs battle will be won or lost in cities in many, many ways. And increasingly that we see that cities like Ho Chi Minh and Bangkok and Bombay are facing urban flooding and equity issues. That's a process of inclusive development we are talking about. And the incidence of poverty is already highest in Asia, and most of it is in urban. So when we look at the landscape in the diverse and complex Asia, I think a lot of work needs to be done at the subnational level, district and subdistrict level, and not just rural but also urban.
So we're going to stop for a tea and coffee break now, and I think we'll carry on. You're back by 3:45. It's a bit unrealistic. I think we'll make it 4. But please don't go away. There is this paper that Helen Pico and Nick Moss have written that summarises some of the results of the CDKN dialogues in 3 regions and some of these perspectives that Andrew has been talking about. So do pick up a copy of this. But after the break, we're going to hear from Alison Doig and other colleagues who've been working on a new paper on why the SDGs must act on climate change. At least I hope we're going to. It's not in the room at the moment. We'll also be hearing from some new research partners with CDKN on some of the challenges to assess the economic impacts of different climate change scenarios on achieving the SDGs. And actually, we want your inputs to that. So it's a sort of methodological challenge to which we want your contributions. And finally, Emily Wilkinson from the Home team here in ODI will be seeking to tackle the question on climate change and DRR, which we've had a question online in addition to your earlier question, and that linkage, which is something that perhaps hasn't had the attention it merits up till now, at least in our discussion this afternoon, but I think in general. So don't go, but some people may have to go, and Mel, I don't know if we can persuade you to stay, but if not, I'd certainly like to thank you for being prepared to come and speak to us and be open and frank and to have an ongoing dialogue. I think your invitation to be working and sharing on this together is exactly the way we would all like it to be from ODI CDKN. I think everyone in the room really appreciate the way you and David and others have worked over the last year, and so it has genuinely seems to have been a very open working group from the UK perspective, I think we can say. So thank you very much for all you've done in that. David, are we going to enjoy your company for a bit longer?
I'm afraid I've got to go to a thing we're doing at the House of Commons with a report on the effects on the UK economy of meeting the UK's climate targets. So I fear I need to make a move to get that.
I think you should go and influence those fellows on the other side of the river. So that seems an important task. But thank you very much all, and a round of applause to our panellists.